Hello, I hope all of you are doing very well. I just thought I should create a short video. I don't know how short or long it's going to be, in which I'm going to share with you some main points pertaining to the articles that you are supposed to read before Monday, right? We have class on Monday. I have posted some 3 short articles on Sakai that I expect you to read. And as you read these articles, I want you to take main points that occur in your mind as you're reading through. I want you to also create some questions that you are going to be asking our guest speaker. So the first 1 hour of class is going to be with a guest speaker. She's going to engage us. And I am hoping that you all are going to be great participants. You're going to pose some questions, you're going to share some comments, and that will actually enable me to determine the extent to which you are being engaged in this class. How about that? I just thought probably sharing some of the main points is going to motivate you to go to Sakai and read the articles. I have shared the articles through Sakai. Go to the resource area, go to the assignments area. I did send a message in Sakai that you should have gotten. I also did post the articles through our WhatsApp group. So whatever method that you are using to get connected in this class, I am hoping that you saw the articles and you are engaging yourself in reading them. So I'm going to share with you some of the main points. Let me try to launch the PowerPoint here that I just created and go ahead and share the PowerPoint with you. So I am hoping here that you are seeing my screen, right? Again, this PowerPoint is about preparing for class on Monday. And the idea is to share with you some of the main points that you are going to be engaging in as you read each of the 3 articles. And the 3 articles, as you see here on the PowerPoint, Overlooked No More, Homer Plessy, who sat on a train and stood up for civil rights. The next article is Unmet Promise on Equality by Fred Harris and Allen, again, from New York Times. And then the last one is a pretty recent article on the persistent threats of school segregation, on school segregation. Again, as I said, as you read each of the articles, you want to make sure that you make some personal notes on the articles and write your comments, intriguing comments that you think are something that we can talk about, and also create some questions to ask the guest speaker. Now let's quickly look at the very first article. The first article that I would want you to read is the one on Plessy. And the title, if you look on Sakai, you are not going to see this title that states here, Overlooked No More, because that copy doesn't do a good job in getting everything. So I would rather you go through this link that I have here, where you're going to read the full article. That article basically focuses on the life of Homer Plessy. And some of you must have had a class or two or more in which your professor talked to you about Plessy. You must have heard about Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, he was an African American whose grandfather, Jermaine Plessy, was a white Frenchman who came all the way from France. He settled first in Haiti and then moved to New Orleans, specifically in Louisiana. He got married to a free woman of color, right? So you see here how we have a white getting married to a black, and had Plessy's dad, who was called Joseph Adolphe. He was one of 8 children. And to Joseph Adolphe and his wife, Plessy Homer, the great Plessy that we constantly hear about in the history of America, Plessy was born on March 17, 1863. So now if you look at his generation, his grandfather was white. So Plessy was said to have 7/8 of white blood in him. And if you remember the 1-drop rule, where if one of the drops of blood that you have in you is black, you are automatically a black. So this article again portrays Plessy as one who was really important in the history of African America, in the history of the United States of America in general. When his father died, he was only 6 years old, and his mother then got married to another man, Victor Dupas, who already had 6 children from a previous marriage. His wife had also passed away. So this was Plessy now growing up in a home with his stepfather, who was a social activist. At the time when Plessy was born, the president, Abraham Lincoln, had already signed the Emancipation. And so he lived in a moment, in a period where he kind of enjoyed some kind of freedom. However, we all know that even after the emancipation, there was a lot of resistance to give freedom to the African Americans. So Plessy followed the footsteps of his stepdad, who was a shoemaker. He became a shoemaker. His stepdad was also a social activist. And so Plessy also became a strong social activist. Now, in 1887, Plessy was such an active socialist, socialist. He was a vice president of the Justice, Protective, Educational, and Social Club, an organization that was determined to reform the education, public education in New Orleans. There was still a lot of segregation going on. Plessy in 1888 got married to a woman, wonderful woman. They had no kids, but he was still so devoted in his civil action to make sure that African Americans got the same benefits as the whites. On June 7, 1892, he volunteered himself to actually disobey the Louisiana Separate Car Act on riding train cars. In Louisiana then, there was this act stating that the blacks could not ride in the same cars as the whites. Plessy, being such an activist, with his other team of civil disobedient guys, they decided that they were going to outgrow that act. So he did disobey. He was arrested, and the judge that was decided, the judge that was supposed to decide on if he was guilty or not, actually upheld the Separate Car Act. Plessy's lawyers, they took the case up to the Supreme Court, where again, Plessy was found guilty by 7 out of 8 justices who took on this case. He had to pay $25 fine, and the sole justice, who was originally from Kentucky, made a statement. He was the only dissent who did not agree with the ruling, and he actually stated that our Constitution is colorblind. Now, the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, where Plessy was found guilty, actually defined the Jim Crow era of segregation. And this was an era where Black people were segregated. They could not ride on the same train as the whites. They could not attend the same lodging. They could not be in specific places with whites. This ruling actually continued to empower white supremacy movements, a movement that prevented the equal status for Blacks in white America. After the ruling determining that Plessy was guilty, he moved quietly to live with his wife and finally died in 1925. You would realize that this case on Plessy versus Ferguson that was actually focused on this doctrine of separate but equal is actually significant, should be significant. However, most of the time we hear about the case in 1955, so many years after, almost 25 or 35 years later after Plessy died, when Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat to a white person. And this was after the 1954 Supreme Court case on Brown versus Board of Education, with all justices unanimously dismissing separate but equal doctrine in racial segregation of children in public schools as unconstitutional. This is one of the greatest Supreme Court cases in history, which was supposed to create an equal playing ground for whites and Blacks in the United States. After you read this article, the question that you should have in your mind is, to what extent has the United States actually kept to its promise, kept to this ruling of separate but equal as unconstitutional? Do we actually see that going on now in the United States? In 2004, during a book signing, when an author kind of brought together the two families, a descendant of the Plessy family and Ferguson Faber, a great-granddaughter of the judge who upheld the Louisiana separate car act. These two were brought together, and in 2009, they forged and formed together a foundation that petitioned for Places Day to be honored every June 7th in New Orleans, and actually also argued for the renaming of a street, Homer Plessy Way, and they continue to uphold the legacy of Plessy in New Orleans. So after reading this article, I want you to actually think about the effect of the lived experience of racial groups in America, specifically African Americans. I want you to think about the Emancipation Act and the resistance to give freedom. You would realize that freedom is power. And actually, on this day that we have today, we are all locked down because of COVID-19. Our freedom to move around has been taken away from us. And we are not even up to a month into it. And you can agree with me that there is so much fear on what will happen after the shutdown, the lockdown that comes following COVID-19. After our freedom to move around has been taken away and given back to us, what is the impact of this shutdown on our lives going forward? Now, when you compare the COVID-19 pandemic and the effect that it's going to be having with respect to freedom, compare this to the freedom that African Americans were deprived of for centuries, and then later on given in little teaspoons, not completely given. They were given and somehow they were prevented from getting it. And let's just assume that they have been totally given their freedom. Can you imagine the past experience, the lived experience that would today still be impacting this group of people? So that is why when we talk about the current effect of the past history of minority growth, it is very important that we look at the history. And Plessy Homer, the case of Plessy Homer, it's a very great eye-opener for us to see what actually happened to minorities back in the days, and if they are still experiencing this effect, the effect of this history passed long ago. What can we do to make things different? The second article, Unmet Promise of Equality by Fred. Again, I would recommend that you read the article through the link rather than the hard copy uploaded to Sakai, because that doesn't really show you more and it's not as clear as if you would have gone directly to the link. In this article, the authors are actually helping us to look at this overruled separate but equal that was tend to be unconstitutional, that took place in 1954, and what we currently have now, over 60 years later. How do we see that? It points to evidences using some great graphs to show us the state of segregation currently in our nation. You're going to see graphs that shows differences in median household income, differences in household wealth, in home ownership, in CEO positions, and mass incarceration based on different types of crimes. These are some great pointers for you to see the effect of segregation in this country. And again, it gives you another pointer or a series of pointers to help you reflect on the issues. It helps you to think about segregation or the issues that ensued due to segregation with a systems lens. It's not just one element. There are so many elements that come together and the interaction, which makes it such a challenging problem to solve. So this article, again, with the evidence that it shows you, will help you to reflect and be able to have some comments and questions for our guest speaker. But again, this article, I want that as you read it, you should be thinking about public schools. We have looked at the characteristics of public schools. We have explored our personal K-12 experiences. So this article is another way for you to typically explore your own self-experiences, which would help you to appreciate the experiences that others are going through with respect to segregated schools in our country. The third article, titled The Persistent Threat of School Segregation, that I could not get a link to that article, so you would have to read the uploaded PDF version. And this article, again, doesn't focus only on African Americans. It looks at the various racial groups that we have in the United States. Now, unlike in the early parts of the century, where we were basically talking about white and black, African Americans and white Americans, we are now in an era of multiple racial groups. We have African Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, white ethnic groups. And the interesting thing or the challenge is that within these large racial groups, we have sub and subgroups. Take, for example, African Americans. Back in the times of Plessy, African Americans were basically African Americans that had come to the United States and that have the relationship with slavery. African Americans today, they come from different parts of the world, and you're now having African Americans like me who do not have any relationship with the slavery ancestors of this country. And therefore, when we are talking about the different challenges that different racial groups are having, we also have to look at the different components, the different subgroups within these large racial groups. So this article helps us to look at the segregation in a broader way, to look at segregation with respect to racial groups, not just one. And in our class where we are talking about cultural competence, where race is not the only identifier to show differences, to show diversity, there are other identifiers like age, sexual orientation, religious groups, which makes it more complicated when we are talking about segregation in school and what we can do to make sure that every student in the public school has a fair education. What are your perspectives on how we can resolve the unfair education in our system? This excerpt by a Harvard Law School professor, very intriguing. This excerpt pertains to the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. He asked the question and he stated, is separate equal? And to him he said, separate is almost never equal. Once you say things are separate, they are not equal, especially when you start think about the social meanings that are attributed to being separate. Then you are immediately stigmatizing one group against the other. It means one group is more superior or is superior to the other. And he went ahead to say, the ruling, that is the ruling on Plessy versus Ferguson, suggested that if people of color feel inferior as a result of these laws like the Louisiana separate car, it is their own fault. It is essentially part of blaming the victim and pretending that the feeling of subjugation and subordination is simply a problem in the mind of the person on the receiving end. I found this really interesting, and immediately I thought about the video that we watched in class on and doll, the brown and white doll, where the minority, the Black kids, overwhelmingly identified the white doll as the good doll and the brown doll as the bad doll because one was black and one was white. So in that case, the ruling in the Plessy versus Ferguson case was basically saying that if these young kids, if they're feeling, if they're not having self-esteem or they're feeling some sense of inferiority, they are to blame. And I'm going to ask you, should they be blamed? So those were some main points as you read those three articles, and I hope that helps. Going ahead to the assignments that are on Sakai, it's very important that you are working on your assignments and posting them as requested. The service learning final reflection, you should be able to do that. It's important that you upload your final document on your weekly reflections on service learning. We talked about that already. Respond to the prompts related on affirmative action. That was due last week, and I still see that some of you have not yet posted your responses to the prompts. Please, you want to make sure that you do those. Even if it is closed, I'm going to go ahead and reformat Sakai so that you should be able to upload your responses. I also want to remind you about the assessment following last week's session. The assessment that is related to the two articles that you read, The 5 Dimensions of Multicultural Education by James Bank, and the other article on what it means to be culturally competent. And then for Monday, I've highlighted this in red. It is important that you read the 3 articles that I've given you the headlines about. I want you to also go back to the article that I had uploaded on affirmative action, to which most of you have already responded to. These 4 handouts are going to be very important in the presentation that our guest speaker, Gildaya JD, who is the Associate Vice President and the Associate General Counsel for Providence College. She's going to engage us in reflecting on issues related to affirmative action. And the 3 articles that I just shared with you and uploaded on Sakai as well as the handout that I sent to you that discussed different affirmative action cases in the US, right? Landmark cases like the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Sweet versus Penta case on the state of Texas, providing separate but unequal law schools for Blacks and whites, Brown versus Board of Education case, the case on the Regent on University of California versus Bakke, that was specifically on UC Davis, my alma mater, the medical school, the case on Gratz versus Bollinger in the University of Michigan, the case on Grutter versus Bollinger, again in the University of Michigan, Parents versus Seattle and Meredith versus Jefferson, Fisher versus University of Texas. So it's very important that you go back and read the handouts and look into the specifics of these cases and have some questions that are still lingering in your minds with respect to these cases, because you're going to have someone, an expert, a lawyer, who is going to help you understand some of the issues that were presented in those cases. It's also important that you remind yourself on the 14th Amendment equality principle, specifically Title VI, that prohibits discrimination based on race and color, Title VII of the Civil Rights that prohibits discrimination based on race and color, religion, sex, national origin, also Title IX of the Education that prohibits discrimination based on sex in educational program. Please, it's very important that you have these articles, these handouts handy. If not handy, at least have main points related to what you've read so as to engage our guest speaker on Monday. After our guest speaker is done with us, we are going to reconvene in Zoom and in our Teams group to continue the discussions on the two articles that we have read, what it means to be culturally competent, dimensions of multicultural education. Those two articles are very, very important with respect to you responding to the criteria, to the themes that I require of you in your different cultural group projects. As you read these articles and as you get different presentations and subsequent articles, it is very important that you constantly refer to your cultural group projects. Again, I also want to recommend that if you have your assigned textbook, Spare Parts by Davis Joshua and Fatima Books on the Spirit catches you and you fall down, please, I strongly recommend that you continue to read those books because they actually portray a lot of issues that are directly related to the issues that we are going to be discussing on this class, and specifically will help you appreciate diversity, what it means to be culturally competent, and it will give you the knowledge and skills that you need to use to engage in a society that requires you to be culturally competent. So this is all I have for you, and I hope that this helps to prepare you for our class on Monday. So I'm looking forward again to a dynamic group of students on Monday. Come prepared with your comments, come prepared with your questions, because I'm telling you, you are in for a great retreat when you're going to meet Gildaya on Monday. Have a great weekend and stay safe. Bye-bye.